Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I am honored and so excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Vishaan Chakrabarti and Reed Kroloff. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for introductions. Vishaan Chakrabarti is an architect, public thought leader, and the founder of Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, a Manhattan-based design studio dedicated to building ecological, equitable, and joyous communities. He is the creative director for a variety of projects, including Brooklyn's Domino Sugar Refinery, Cleveland's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Princeton's Hobson College, and New York's Penn Station, among many others. As former Manhattan planning director after the events of 9/11, Vishaan helped to save the High Line, extend the number 7 subway line, advance Moynihan Station, rebuild the East River waterfront, expand Columbia University's campus, and reincorporate the street grid at World Trade Center. Reed Kroloff is dean and the Rowe Family College of Architecture endowed chair at the College of Architecture at Illinois Institute of Technology here in Chicago. A leader in the fields of architecture, urbanism, and design, Reed has managed renowned design programs, I highlighted actually all the verbs in bold. You do a lot of things. Edited the architectural profession's leading publication, spoken at gatherings such as TED and the Aspen Design Conference, written for a wide range of magazines and newspapers, appeared in a number of nationally televised programs on architecture and design, been an invited critic at schools and professional organizations across the country, and advised clients on some of the most significant projects of the last 20 years, leading the New York Times to describe him as, quote, the man with the list at architecture's party. And now let's welcome Vishaan Chakrabarti and Reed Kroloff to FAN.
It's great to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lonnie and Anne-Marie. Hi, Vishaan.
Hi, Reed. Great to be with you. Thank you, Lonnie. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thanks to all the folks at FAN. Great to be here.
Agreed as well. I think both Vishaan and I are sufficiently embarrassed by those resumes that were written by our mothers, apparently. So we can move very quickly on to, I think we'll start with Vishaan giving an introduction to the book and some of the ideas in it, and we'll follow that up with a conversation right after that. So Vishaan, why don't I turn it over directly to you?
Great. Thank you, Reed. And yeah, so why don't we start with the slides? I'm going to give kind of a brief, kind of précis about what the book is about, and hopefully everyone can see the slides. I've been working on this book for 7 years now with the tremendous help of my publishers at Princeton University Press, who've just been absolutely amazing. And the reason this book has been such an endeavor is because it's something that I think, Reed, you and I have spoken about a lot, which is the relevance of architecture to the big issues of our day. We are at the cusp of a major presidential election. There's all sorts of things going on in our world. And, I don't think most people think of architecture, urbanism, the built environment as having all that much to do with issues like climate change or social and political division. And I really wanted to make a case for why I think architecture is not just relevant to all of those issues, but the design of our built environment is critical to help address some of those issues. So next slide, please. So architecture, for those who don't know, and I think this is true for really every discipline, but certainly for architecture, is a constant struggle with history. Much of what we read about in the papers, the turmoil in the Middle East, Putin's kind of desire to resurrect the Soviet Union, make America great again, implicit in the again is history, right? And how we think about our history. And architecture is both a mirror and a window into that struggle that we have as a species. And so, much of 20th century architecture, I think, was about erasing history, erasing narrative, replacing existing communities with new ideas, urban renewal. And much of the 21st century, I think, is in many ways the opposite. It is about celebrating history, celebrating narrative, celebrating communities, And so I'm always drawn as a first slide to this Paul Klee painting, and actually a Laurie Anderson lyric that is a Walter Benjamin quote, that history is an angel being blown backwards into the future. And it's a lovely but kind of struggling image, this notion of an angel being blown backwards into the future, carrying all of history and its baggage with it. And I think this is critical to understand where we need to go and what we need to build and what we need to do as a society to create a better world. And I'll try to expand upon that as we go further. So next slide, please. And so that's about history being blown backwards into the future. But for a lot of people today, and especially for a lot of young people, the future is a very tenuous place. It's and this is my most depressing slide, I promise you. But you know, between social media and artificial intelligence, the lack of affordability that I think is I think even hard for people of older generations to truly understand how much people are struggling with affordability. Um, the amount of social division, political, racial tension, not just in our country, but across the world. And then this meta narrative of climate change. And, you know, these storms we just saw in the South, but just extreme weather events becoming more common occurrences, that these all are what frame our idea about the future. Next. And then I will throw into that mix something that I think we don't think about as much, but human growth. We're at about 8.4 billion people on the planet. The UN estimates that we'll be at about 10.4 by 2086. Much of that growth in the global south, a lot of our industrialized nations are declining in terms of population. But what we're seeing, especially across, you know, parts of India, China, Turkey, Russia, is widespread suburbanization. Most of the world lives in what's known as an urban environment, but that doesn't really mean urbanity. What it means is a lot of this across 6 continents. Next slide, please. In addition to this, it means a lot of growth in our cities, but that too, I would argue, is rather banal. That we are building a lot of metropolis, but not a lot of urbanity. And again, this is across 6 continents where growth, I think, is being felt as something that is increasingly homogenous, the same kind of blue glass tower with the Starbucks at the bottom. And here I'm not talking about kind of star museums or star projects. I'm talking about the quotidian, you know, the basic vernacular that builds our human environment. And that this is really suffering, and it's actually serving to disconnect us from ourselves and our histories. Next, please. And so part of what the book does is it goes back to antiquity. And this is a foldout from the book that tracks the nature of human settlement, basically across continents, from really the beginnings of our time as a Homo sapien on this planet, where we have consistently built collective culture. And that the form of that collective culture, the grid in Greece versus the grid in ancient China versus the grid in Rome, each had symbolic power and meaning that went well beyond whether or not we needed cities to barter. And so, you know, even in this post-pandemic environment where we now, you know, can all conceivably work from the top of a mountain, but we still continue to gather in, you know, public spaces and cities, restaurants are jam-packed. Urban affordability is still a huge problem because there's so much demand for urban housing. And all of that proves that we are collective as a species. And we like to build this thing called urbanity. So what I wanted to do is give more definition to the idea of what urbanity even means. Because, next please, it may not mean what you think it does. First of all, it doesn't necessarily mean something that's synonymous with community. Community can be a very beautiful idea, but it can also be a very tribal idea. And I think one of the key aspects of urbanity for me, in terms of what the book talks about, is the idea of celebrating difference, and that great urban spaces make or encourage people of difference, not just of racial difference or people who pray differently or look differently, but also think differently, vote differently, right? In the same physical space. And that when we're in the same physical space, we're not so scary as we might be, say, on social media. And so that idea of what I like to call positive social friction is elemental to the idea of urbanity. Next, please. The other thing urbanity is not necessarily about is size. And I would bet for a lot of you, when you think of the word urban, you think of big cities, you might think of cosmopolitanism. But for me, again, the book goes through why the idea of urbanity is different than the idea of size, that you can have this idea of positive social friction, of mixing of difference in big places or in quite small villages. And sometimes big cities might be quite large, but actually not be very urbane because they're quite segregated. So it's important to have that distinction in mind. Next, please. And then there are some other conditions. One of the things that urbanity encourages, and this is a Charles Correa drawing of an idea by Constantine Doxiades, a Greek city planner from mid-century of middle of last century, where, and this is well before blue people and red people, as we think of them in politics, but Doxiades had this theory that every once in a while, someone who thought quite differently about the world was born. And they felt quite isolated. And what they would often do is go to denser and denser places to find other people who thought differently about the world, until they got to a place that was dense enough that they not only found other people with whom they could make common cause, but that they started changing mainstream culture, that this is actually necessary for progress. And this could be a diagram of the Arab Spring. But this is, again, a condition of urbanity, that it creates this culture of progress, regardless of the size of place. Next, please. And then there's this idea of human health. There's this great book called The Good Life by Waldinger and Schultz, and it's the longest study of human happiness ever conducted. And it is talks about how if you control for a bunch of variables, smoking, exercise, so forth, that it's borne out that the strength of our social connections is what actually leads to better health and longer lifespans. And so for me as an architect, my question immediately becomes, what forms of urbanity then become conducive to these idea of positive social connections? Next, please. And then if you then extend that into public space, that what you start to realize is that the public space of our communities, that the public realm is absolutely fundamental to creating all those conditions of social connection, of progress, of positive social friction, of celebrating difference. And these are just some beautiful images done by a guy named Mark Faulkner in our office. And what it talks about are both spaces we know that were designed, like the bottom right at Pompidou in Paris, but also the top right, which is really interesting, which is the bottom of Norman Foster's HSBC headquarters in Hong Kong, which has become a gathering spot on weekends for a lot of the housemaids of Hong Kong, many of whom are from the Philippines. Clearly not what this space was intended to be by a master architect for a major international bank, but has become this place of serendipity and of all of these aspects of urbanity that we just discussed. Next, please. And so what I think has become very interesting is increasingly we're seeing, especially coming out of the Pritzker Committee and the Pritzker Awards, architecture that is celebrating this kind of building of urbanity across the world. And I won't go through these projects in detail. Reed knows them well. We can talk about them later if we like. But to me, this is a fascinating kind of phase shift or sea change for the Pritzker, which has, for many years celebrated kind of architecture and celebrity. This is a very different model in terms of what it's premiating. Next, please. and that we're seeing all sorts of examples worldwide, especially even in the global south. The upper right, Marina Tassobam's mosque and community center. On the lower right, O'Donnell and Toomey's low-income housing project in Dublin. On the lower right is Michael Maltson's project for the formerly unhoused in Los Angeles. And so these projects are all kind of extraordinary in terms of this idea of very venerable architects working on behalf of the vulnerable to build urbanity. Next, please. And so what I wanted to close with is, I'm going to try to go through these slides quite quickly now, is some examples of our work at POW, Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, of how we're also trying to advance urbanity, because I think it's important as a practitioner to talk not just about the theory of urbanity and why it's important, but whether we're kind of proving it out. And so we have a set of practice areas. We work mainly on affordable and social housing, cultural and educational institutions. We do a lot of infrastructure and workspaces of the future. In the center of that is always this idea of thought leadership. That's a big reason why I like to write and lecture to find folks like yourselves. And then surrounding all of that is always the process of co-design, that we don't do it on behalf of people, we do it with people and with the communities we serve. So next, please. And so we started out doing a lot of advocacy work with the Times editorial board about things like reclaiming public streets for mass transit, for public space. Next. And also a lot of the work we've been doing for Penn Station, which often was pro bono work, but we're trying to fix the nation's busiest transit hub, which is frankly a national embarrassment. That's a much longer story. But again, a form of urbanity in terms of creating that connective public tissue in the city. Next, please. And then on to a couple of built projects. Our first very small thing, but important thing, in the small town of Columbus, Indiana, right in the heart of Indiana. It's an architectural mecca for a variety of reasons we can talk about. But this is an absolutely really beautiful town. Cummins Engine is based here, very diverse town. And we won something called the Miller Prize, where we were given an award to build a pavilion. And we decided, in conjunction with the community, to build that pavilion over the main intersection in town, because it is a place of celebration for a lot of different people. So next, please. And so what happens there is very frequently so cars and trucks can drive under this canopy. This canopy is the simplest thing. It's steel, it's some vinyl, it's some lighting. But what it does is it creates a sense of invitation. And the community has done everything from Pride Week to all sorts of ethnic celebrations, inviting people, I would argue, across political lines. And it reminds me of something one of my favorite architects, Aldo Van Eyck, said: whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more. And what all that really is saying is that it's not the architecture that is important as much as the way in which people give meaning to it. And so there's all sorts of things that we could discuss architecturally about the form of this thing, but the real importance of it is the way people have rediscovered this intersection, which doesn't always have to be for cars, right? On nights and weekends, in order to have it be a celebratory place for people. Next, please. And then a jump in scale, but not too far away, in Cleveland, Ohio, an expansion of IMP's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. This project absolutely terrifies me because we are expanding upon the work of one of the great masters of the 20th century. And the important thing here is we're building a piece of architecture that's both kind of reverent and irreverent to the IMP building. But if you go to the next slide, what you'll see is what we convinced, and this is the connection for the architects in the room, this absolutely terrifying connection between the new building and the old. So, architecture is about this at some level. But then if you go to the next slide, what that connection is creating, and something that we work with our client on, is to create this unticketed space in the lobby of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame costs about $20 to get into. We wanted it to be a place that invited the community in, invited a lot of school children in, where people could do jam sessions, listen to music, make music. As and in Cleveland, Lake Erie has some inclement weather every once in a while. This space looks right out on the lake, and be a place just for, again, that idea of community, of positive social friction, of celebrating the history of rock and roll, but like that angel being blown backwards, understanding the future of rock and roll. Next, please. And then a site I've been working on for many years in my former post as a partner at Shop Architects, where we did the master plan, and now as an architect and also working with a great landscape architect, Lisa Switkin at Field Operations. This is the Domino site on the Brooklyn waterfront. It's an 11-acre site that has really 4 or 5 different communities around it, including an Orthodox Jewish community, an African American community, a Latinx community. And those communities never really interacted that much in physical space until this waterfront park was built. And the playground, where I see all of their children playing together. And I am naive enough to believe that when those children are playing together, and that if decades from now they're confronted with a conflict like what's happening in the Middle East, because they knew each other as children, they saw that difference eyeball to eyeball, face to face, that they will hopefully deal with these challenges in a better way than we are right now. We, in addition to help activate the space, were given the assignment of putting a creative office building, an event space in the sugar refinery. If you go to the next slide, where we actually built a new building inside of the old building. It's really an extraordinary idea of palimpsest, of layering history, so that you move again from history into the future. And the reason I think this building is so important is because it can't be anywhere but where it is. And there's a lot of architectural details. There's landscape architecture, like the 25 trees that are growing inside the building. But really, to me, the important thing is that this building is pulling the narrative of its community with it into the future. It's not trying to erase that history. Next, please. A couple of other examples. This is at Princeton University, right in the heart of the neo-Gothic campus, where, again, there is a constant struggle with history and sometimes challenging history. This is Hobson College. It's donated by a very prominent African-American alumnus from Princeton. And we wanted this building, next please, to reflect in its materiality the history of Princeton. So you see the new building palette compared to the historic building palette, but in clearly a contemporary form that represented a kind of new moment in Princeton's history. Next, please. And then a social housing project on the opposite end of the budget scale, a very low budget project in East New York. This is 2,200 units of all affordable housing, everything from transitional housing for the formerly unhoused, all the way out to workforce housing, including some home ownership units. That's a curbless street, which is something you'd more typically see in Copenhagen than East New York. But worked for years with this community to get the palette right. Next, please. And to really focus not on the idea of capital A architecture, like, say, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but to focus on dignity. And again, how within very limited economic means to build housing that people were proud to call their front door their home. Next, please. Which leads to kind of the closing part of the talk, which is just, we recently did an op-ed for the New York Times that talked about how there is room in New York City to house 1.3 million more New Yorkers in new housing that could be built affordably and be built within the neighborhood scale and neighborhood context of the various communities of New York City. And so this got a lot of play, but it reminded me of something, next please, that I think is the larger issue for us as a country. And I go back to where I started with the election, which is, you know, I'm thrilled to see Vice President Harris call for 3 million new homes. But of course, this immediately, as an architect, makes me say, this is fantastic. It's really important for our affordability crisis. But what kind of homes, where, and for whom? Next, please, because the federal government, as well-intentioned as I think the vice president is, the federal government has a pretty tough history with the building of housing in the country. Through most of the 20th century, we either did the stuff on the left, right, which created the most carbon intensive, racially and socially segregated form of human settlement that the world's ever seen, or the stuff on the right, which is a much more complex history of tower in the park housing. Some call it warehousing the poor. But I think both of these are not models that represent the future. Next, please. And so I think in the future, we need a much more locally responsive kind of housing. That's a 3-story housing module that we've been working on that actually is a very, very low budget for a variety of reasons that we can get into if people are interested, near a train station, that I think is the kind of housing that people need increasingly. That again isn't about the single family house, but isn't necessarily about the big skyscraper either, just a kind of gentle density. Next, please. And what's interesting about that gentle density is that it could bring this idea that I like to talk about in the book more generally, which is we don't have to fear a planet of 10.4 billion people. We could create a planet of nature, culture, and joy by reusing the buildings we have, creating great public spaces. Next, and also by doing this thing as architects, working with communities, working with policymakers, of creating this thing I like to call connective design. So this is a very architectural idea where every front door goes, where every loading dock goes, is either a sense of segregation or invitation, depending on how you do it and with whom you do it. And if you can do that, I believe you can create this sense of positive social friction that leads to nature, culture, and joy. Next. And that, for me, ties to the idea of my favorite economist, because she also draws, Kate Raworth, who wrote this wonderful book called Donut Economics. And what Kate talks about is that if we're going to have this kind of growth, and we know we're going to have this kind of population growth, that we shouldn't just have growth for growth's sake in terms of the economy, but that we could live inside of this donut, where if we build too little, if we use too few resources, then people fall into the hole of the donut and have a shortfall in terms of their human needs of health, education, food, shelter. But if we overshoot that donut, we overshoot the planet's resources. And so to me, things like that 3-story housing module are about how we can live sustainably and joyously inside of that donut. Next, please. And that could lead to what I call at the end of the book, the Garden of Urban, which is a kind of utopian idea, but a kind of pragmatic utopian idea for the idea that we could all live harmoniously on the planet within its resources and means, and that architecture and how we think about the built environment is essential to that. So thanks very much. I'm going to close with that and then shift over back to Reed.
Great. Thank you, Vishaan. There is so much to unpack from your 20-minute précis of the book, let alone the book itself. And I'm going to hold it up so everybody knows what it looks like. Looks like that. Oops, there, looks like that. It's a beautifully designed book, much like your previous book, which I want to come back to in a minute. But you said a few things here that I think could probably benefit from just a little more definitional discussion, because
Sure.
they're terms that I think people might not know. So let's start with one. I mean, you're an urbanist, right? At heart, though you are an architect and you practice architecture and you've got a thriving practice. And people should know that not only are you an architect, but your architectural practice is relatively recent in a career that's included architecture from every perspective. Vishaan working as as a public servant in the government, trying to create the governmental conditions that allow good architecture to happen, or Vishaan working as a developer, which he did for a number of years, trying to build in our particular economic system the capital underpinnings that enable.
Oh, that was for a train station. Yes, it was a complex thing. Yes,
Complex thing. And then worked as an architect in a more traditional role in an earlier part of his career in somebody else's firm. This is not unusual, a big firm, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, but now in his own office, right? So has taught and lectured. So Vishaan has really been all around and through and at the center of the profession. That's important to know, because even though he does all of that, the thing I think you are mostly is an urbanist, and someone who would argue passionately, as you've just done, for the potential of the urban environment and our occupation of it and our creation of it before we can even occupy it. So you used a few terms, and I want to go back and ask you to explicate those terms just a little bit. The first one I think that you came up that you just in terms of when you said it was positive social friction, which I think is a fantastic term, and because A, it's got 3 words, and I always think 3 is better, but B, it's almost self-definitional, right? And it bounces back and forth between the word in the middle and the 2 on the end of it. But I was wondering if you could define it a little more and then give a couple of really specific examples so people can start to absorb that into their conversation.
so sure. And you know, what I think about is that positive social friction is this idea of serendipity, of celebrating difference, and wanting to go places where we encounter the unexpected. So, what's the difference between walking down Main Street in Disneyland, right, and walking down the center of a street in Chicago or New York or Tokyo or Columbus, Indiana? It is that, in Disneyland, everything, of the unexpected has been taken away, except for the occasional surprise that is also planned, right? I think part of the joy of being in real community is not just having the same pumpkin spice latte, but dealing with and having joy over the idea of surprise. I think especially for young people, but I think for all of us. And the reason I call it friction is because sometimes it might entail some level of discomfort, right? And I think one of the joys of true public space, as opposed to digital space, social media, is with social media, we have algorithms that are trying to make us angry about each other's differences. Whereas with public space, we can see someone wearing a burqa and realize that that person is actually not scary. That person's with their family. They maybe have the same concerns for their children that you do. They might want to get out of the same rain that you do. And that is a reminder of our common humanity within the context of difference. And I think that's critical for the moment that we live in. I think Reed, I've driven cross country 6 times. I think it's an extraordinary country. And I actually believe that neither the caricatures that blue states have of red states or red states have of blue states are true. And that it's actually a wonderful kind of collage of a country. And that people are actually quite accepting of difference in campgrounds I've been to in Columbus, Indiana, and in New York City. And it's one of the great things about this country, and it's one of the great things about true cities. And so positive social friction for me is absolutely definitional of what a great city is, a great community is, because it gives us the joy of surprise. And that makes
So,
us think and grow.
so is positive social friction possible in a place? I'm going to stick with Disney for a minute then. In a place like Celebration, which is the town for the folks on listening in, which is the new town, they call it that, built by Disney on the perimeter of the theme parks in Florida, a built from scratch town with a built from scratch old looking downtown, and everything just, instantaneous, like subdivisions are. Is positive social friction there? Can a community like that, a simulacrum of
It may be. I've never
this is
been to
work?
Celebration. It may be, but I think what's challenging about it is that it is by design fighting against that, right? Because I mean, let's take it out of Celebration and just take it to a subdivision where every
Sure,
single
any
house
subdivision.
look
Yeah.
where every house looks the same. This has always amazed me about America, a country like totally forged around the idea of individualism and individual rights. And yet there is this weird interest in everyone like living in a house that looks exactly the same as your neighbor's house, and that actually difference is somehow bad. Like I'm from India. It's very common in middle class India, right? It's unthinkable here that you'd hire an architect to help you design a house that looked a little different than your neighbor. It's very, very common. But here somehow that's like, I don't know what it is. It's uppity, it's elite, it's seen like why you want to be different, what's this difference thing about? Um, so I think if you design environments that are physically homogeneous and are meant to make homogeneity the fundamental appeal, I think you are going to start, like attracting homogeneity. And let's not forget, and I'm not calling all suburbs racist just before I start getting screeds online, but the suburbs were started in the post-World War II period with an enormous racial undercurrent. Redlining was used by banks to keep African American families outside of many suburbs. And we're still living with the legacy of that today, the legacy of the highways that get to those suburbs that tore through poor communities of color and so forth. And so there, what I think we tend to forget, Reed, and I'm glad you brought up Celebration because it's kind of a kind of extraordinary example of what is a more kind of everyday thing. We design our environment. We don't talk about it that way. But and my first book was about this, the fact that since World War II, especially, there was an extraordinary, we didn't call it this, but with the Federal Highway Act and the mortgage interest deduction and the GI Bill and redlining and all of the other things, there was a design idea about how people were supposed to live that de-densified our cities, segregated our population, created extraordinary reliance on fossil fuel, did a bunch of things through design. And that's why the first half of this new book totally fesses up to that and fesses up to our industry, the complicity that architecture and urbanity had in that. But that if you can design that and if you can do that in the course of a few decades, you can design something else. And I think especially younger people, but also empty nesters and other people are looking for something else right now.
So this has always been fascinating to me. I got in big trouble many years ago when I wrote a story about how anodyne and repetitive the suburbs were in Phoenix, Arizona, where I was living at the time. And I thought I had a kind of surefire thing because I hated all these red tile roof houses. And so I wrote a story about how, the suburbs were just killing the city and everything was homogenous and there was no way out. And I felt certain, that everyone would be on my side. And we got letters I was the critic for the paper. We got lots of letters to the editor saying, who are you to tell me that my subdivision home, though it looks just like my neighbor's, is something that I shouldn't like. And that, you know,
and in many ways, that is the fundamental distinction, I think, between my first book and the second book. I think my first book cued to that as well, what you're talking about, what you wrote. But although I'm all for people having personal choices, people should live how they want to live. The problem is we've subsidized since World War II one form of living to the detriment of more urban forms of living that could not only bring a more sustainable and more diverse form of life, but a more joyful form of life, a less lonely form of life. And that's the thing. So if you take the subsidies away, what choices would people make then? So I'm all for people having choices, right? But if you start saying, you know what, we're not going to give people who own a house that's cost more than the average house in America a mortgage interest deduction. And in fact, we might start helping renters out a bit.
yeah.
What would that do?
What would that do? To me, it's a remarkable question. It gets down to a really fundamental thing to me. I know all of these suburbs where I know all of these people who go on vacation to San Francisco, California, to see the famous Victorian painted ladies along the side of the park, right? Beautiful Victorian houses painted up very, very beautifully. If you go to a subdivision today, you can only use the 6 colors that have been predetermined for you.
You can go even further than this. If you look at where most tourism goes in the world, Spanish Steps, the markets of Fez or Istanbul, the tight-knit streets of Tokyo or Shanghai, everyone goes to the pre-car places that have human scale and human intimacy. And then we live by a strip mall. And we don't think about why that distinction is there. But this is why the second book is not so much a screed about the suburbs, but is more about how can we design proactively better places, and the role of the architecture specifically plays in that as opposed to urban planning, because the experience of what we build and the experience of new places matters. And most of what we build around the world, whether it's urban or suburban, is soul crushing.
Yeah.
And
you are absolutely right. And you have a fantastic picture in the book, 2 pictures in the book, aerial photograph of a famous interchange in Los Angeles, freeway interchange, and an aerial photograph immediately adjacent to it of downtown, the center of Florence, Italy, and they are at the exact same scale. And
yes,
the shocking difference of those 2 realities of life, which leads me to the next term that I wanted to bring up that you talk about that I think is so promising. And I'd like you to explain it a little bit to people. You use the term, and I think you've created this term, connective design, right? So if we want to find our way out of the ennui of the suburbs that were the part of your first book and into an active urbanism, or as you refer to it as urbanity, in the second book, and you spend an entire chapter talking about the difference, actually almost 2 chapters, talking about the difference between urban and urbanity, and connective design as an ameliorative opportunity for that distinction. Can you go into that a little bit about what you mean by connective design?
yeah, and full confession, it is the squishiest part of the book, because again, the first book was very data driven.
Very data driven.
Right. This
Lots
book,
of charts, lots of graphs.
lots of charts, and I'm very proud of the fact that even the people who hate what that data said could never find a lot of holes in it. That was before we lived in a fact-free universe. This book is not that. It is much more subjective. And so the best way I can find to explain ideas like connective design is through example. And so really, I think there's 3 chapters actually 4 arguably, that set this up. One is we redrew some of the great places in the world, right? Place de Vosges, but also a refugee camp I know that I think is where a self-taught architect is designing amazing connective space among a very diverse ethnic group that's in that refugee camp. And so both, all ends of culture, formal, informal, wealthy, not wealthy. So we drew that to kind of show that in the example, and then I talk about, just as I just did in the lecture, the work of a lot of people whom I look up to, who are doing this work. And what's so interesting is we have this knee-jerk tendency, especially in the United States, to imagine that what I'm talking about somehow is expensive. And yet almost all of the examples that are in that chapter, in chapter 7, are from the global South, in places that have far less money than we do. And yet they are figuring out how to build these beautiful connective structures that are building places where people connect. And then I talk about some of our work in this context. And then there are those beautiful sketches from Mark that just talk about things that aren't even designed. A pool that the city of New York stopped putting water in, and the community took it over as a public space, as an empty pool. And they have concerts and all sorts of. So, I think there's many, many examples. And that was the best way that I could explain what I meant by connective design, by just showing, drawing, visualizing, photographing, example after example of these places that bring people together in that act of positive social friction. And it is a design act. It is not just kind of like an urban planning policy where you plan a certain amount of density as widgets, and like that's going to somehow, you put a Starbucks at the bottom and a train station there, and boom, you've got a city. It doesn't work that way, right? And there's a quality to experience that's fundamental that, read in many ways, and you will laugh because you know me well enough to know why this is funny. This book is an argument with the first book.
Yes, that's my first question. I just did them out of order. That is literally the first question on my list.
Because the first book is kind of a technocratic book.
Yeah.
And it makes a very empirical argument for why we should live in more dense circumstances, but it doesn't satisfy the human need for why we want to live in those places.
This word is not in that first book.
No, it is not. And, the interesting thing is we settled on that subtitle about 8 months ago, well before joy entered
the political lexicon. Yeah.
Right. But it's not, I believe in zeitgeist. I think sometimes that there's reasons for these coincidences. And we are yearning for a sense of collective joy in our world right now, right? Like this is not a happy moment. And yet I think we have to step back. I mean, I have 2 children. I have to believe in a joyous future, for them, but also for the clients and communities we serve, all the places we go out. If at the end of the day, the work that we're creating, when I see people dance under that canopy in Columbus, Indiana, it's so much more important to me than the canopy itself, right?
Yeah.
Because all I've done is create a platform for how people then want to use space. And that to me is the definition of success.
So having said that, and actually thinking of the canopy, I want to drill down on a kind of a finite example for you to attack for a minute here. And I am speaking now to my friend, Mr. 6 times across the country in a car. The question that I wrote started, you clearly have a hate-hate relationship with the automobile in cities. Not maybe out in the country, but in cities, right?
Yep.
And it's quick and easy to kind of dump on cars, as the great villains of the 20th century. And I don't disagree with you. I don't own an car. I live in Chicago. I don't have a car. And I don't have any problem living in Chicago without a car. It's partly why we moved here. But I'd like you to address 2 things. One, the first, it's one thing to criticize the car. It's another thing to try and undo the car when, I'm going to make this number up, 75% of the cities in the world had their biggest growth in post-automobile times and thus are structured around accommodating the vehicle, right? So how do we realistically undo that in a city like, I don't know, Houston, that where no car, no life, it's not possible. And then secondly, because I know where you're going to go on this, you're going to talk about reclaiming streets. And you had a great word for that as well. And we've seen examples of it, unlikely examples of reclaiming chunks of the busiest city in the US, New York, and just ripping the street away and turning it into public space. But we can't do that on all of our streets. We know that. So can you tell us a little bit about some ideas about reclaiming streets, but also how do we do this in Houston?
Okay, so first of all, I actually love cars and
I
I
know you
love
do.
driving, just not in the city.
That's what I said. You have a hate in the city, but a love-hate.
No, I'm a deeply American human being and I love the American landscape. And you can't do that without a car. But you cannot conflate Thelma and Louise, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You can't conflate driving across this beautiful country with sitting in 2 hours of traffic in Atlanta. You can't. Those are not the same thing.
Yep.
And we have to separate those, just like the suburbs are not rural. That's like another myth we need to debunk. I'm actually seeing more success with what are now called road diets, right? In lots of other parts, most of our work is in, call it the Great Lakes, the industrial Midwest, where I'm seeing it all over the place, where people are doing this thing and it's an incremental thing. And you can do it I'm going to be in Houston in a few weeks, where like the people want public space. And in terms of mass transit, and you're right, this is going to be a slow, difficult transition, but the best, cheapest, easiest, most environmentally efficient way to get new, good, clean mass transit in our cities is to take over lanes for bus rapid transit. Buses, which everyone thinks of as kind of slow and for poor people and so forth, can be incredibly fast and incredibly efficient and zero emission if given their own lane to operate in without cars coming back and forth from that lane. And so you can do that when you get the community desire. And Reed, I've seen this, my wife is from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I never ever thought that would be a place for mass transit and not driving. And there's a very successful light rail system there now. There's a thriving pedestrian downtown. People will vote with their feet and they will tell their leaders what they want. And you are increasingly seeing this. And so I actually see more hope, ironically, in some ways, for cities that are not on the coasts than the liberal cities that are New York, famously struggling to pass congestion pricing. We might be having a harder time of it.
Do you think electric cars are a good thing then or a bad thing because
No. I think they're a good thing, but they don't solve, as an architect, the spatial problem of how much space a car takes up. I don't care if they're autonomous, electric. I don't care if they run on bubblegum. They still are a big metal box that segregates us and keeps us from having positive social friction. I think Lonnie's going to tell us that we're in trouble.
I think Lonnie's going to tell us to get out of Dodge.
Yeah.
No, Lonnie wishes she could put you for another 30 minutes, but guess what? We have after hours. So first of all, Reed, thank you so much. Great conversation. Vishaan, people I know are loving the slide presentation. It was so beautiful and you hit it right there. I want to remind folks, how can you get more of both these gentlemen? They are going to be both at after hours. It's going to be again at 8:05 Central. That's in about 8 minutes from now. How do you get to come buy a copy of Vishaan's beautiful book? I have a copy here. Everybody's get a copy. They are so beautiful. Anne-Marie's been putting the link to purchase is in chat. If you're like, oh, I didn't have chat open, she will throw it in there one more time so that you can get it one more time. You'll get a receipt from our bookseller, the bookstall. In that receipt is the link to register for after hours. Come hang out. After hours is another 55 minutes with these two brilliant men. Pick their brains. There is so many great questions that can be asked. Come hang out and learn. I mean, what an opportunity. Like, Reed, I think you have a side hustle. I'm going to put you to work for FAN. You're very good at this.
He's making a donation to IIT for every copy he sells.
There you go. I'm going to it's going to be dealer's choice here. I'm going to pick a question that Tony posted during the Q&A. We're at 7:58. So Vishaan, this will be kind of like a rapid.
All right.
Here.
I'm going to go really quick.
It says, yeah, acknowledging the suburbs are an enduring part of our world. How can we enhance suburban communities to better serve their residents and the world through improved transportation, stronger community engagement? I know, big question. You got about a minute and a half. Go ahead.
I think the rail-based suburbs, like an Oak Park or something like that, has an enormous opportunity to kind of change, urbanize, and have some of these spaces of urbanity. I think the suburban subdivisions we built during the foreclosure crisis, out in the desert in Phoenix somewhere, tough, very tough. And I think nature's going to reclaim some of it because a lot of it is empty. I worry about how poor it's getting. So those are two very different kinds of suburbs. It's important to remember their distinctions.
Mm-hmm. We did put a link in chat. We had hosted Richard Rothstein, who wrote The Color of Law, about town and
Great
about
book.
lining out and beautiful presentation. So we put that link in chat. The links, for those wondering, the links that you saw in chat, a lot of these will be we'll collate the best ones. We'll send it out with the Zoom recording in another day or two. So you can, if you're like, oh, I couldn't get to all those links fast enough, we'll be getting them in an email from us. So let's wrap up here. Reed, again, we'll see you in about 5 minutes. Vishaan, same to you. What a great conversation. I know we had possibly looked at trying to do this in person, and we hope to welcome you back in the future. You have given us so much to think about, none less than Robert Waldinger, who we had the pleasure of hosting for his book, The Good Life.
Oh, great.
Yeah, him and George Elliott, who ran the grant study at Harvard for many decades. So you're speaking our language here. So thanks, everybody, for showing up tonight. More great programming this week and more great programming in 5 minutes. So thanks, everybody, very much. Great night.